He's here today to talk about characters in games. Let's welcome Kenny Shea DINKIN.
Hi. Thanks. All right, character collision. Let's talk about how characters, bring it, because I love to walk around. All right, so just snap this here. No, go for it. So characters in free-to-play games. Here's what we're going to do. First, I'm going to talk a little about who I am, then why you should care about this topic. Unfortunately, can you hear me if I walk over here? Can you still hear me?
Yep.
All right, great. Unfortunately, I still have to do this. I have to sort of talk about why this is a real topic, even though by now people should believe me. Then we'll do like a little art history of characters in games, just for the last 5 or 6 years. Then, in order to make sense of this, I'm going to talk a little bit about ways that free-to-play games typically or often make money. Then we'll talk a little bit about how free-to-play games have been using characters. We'll try to find some crisscross connections. Then I'll end with some inspiring stuff about some of the experimentation that hasn't yet happened that I think should happen. Okay? Ready? So I need that button-y thing. Do we think it's not going to work? Okay, so who am I? I'm the CCO of Making Fun. I'm the newly minted CCO. I just started. This is a re-startup because it just spun out of News Corp. It has 2 games. A hidden object game called Hidden Express and a collectible card game called Blood Realm, and I'm really excited to be back in the kind of startup world. But it was a little bait and switch for Vinny, who reached out to me when I was, as he said, VP over at the San Francisco studio at Disney, and said, oh, cool, we'll get somebody from Disney Playdom to speak. Little did he know I was leaving. But anyway, before that, I was at Play First. I headed up the creative at Play First, including the Diner Dash series and the publishing business. Then before that, I was at the Learning Company. So I've cut my teeth on characters and story in video games kind of my whole career. It's something I've been interested in for a long time. So that's why I'm talking about this. Okay, why should I care about this? Unfortunately, you still have to, in a video game conference, you have to justify talking about this topic because, let's face it, there's lots of games out there that do fine that don't have characters and don't have story. So I have to spend a little time justifying why you should care about this. The first reason, especially in free-to-play games, is retention. If you work in the free-to-play game sphere, you worry a lot about getting your players to come back every day. And if you come from another field like television or film or comic books, you know that characters, especially character-driven narrative, is like crack. Anybody who stayed up late watching Battlestar Galactica or Lost or 6 Feet Under or Mad Men or whatever, and then gone to like their sweetie and gone, I know it's late, honey, but just one more episode, just one more. Knows this. The comic book guys know this. Frankly, Dickens and Dostoevsky knew this. They used to publish their novels in magazine form every month. It could be the holy grail for retention if we get characters right. And this is especially important in free-to-play games, right, where you have to sort of take your time to get players to come back all the time to pay as they go. So that's one reason. Another reason, and I saw this when I was at Play First, is franchise re-engagement. We had this big hit with Diner Dash, but it was the beloved sort of character flow and the irrational loyalty around that enabled that company to do 26 games around this franchise while I was there, and they've continued to go on and do it in mobile and all over the place. So there's a lot of irrational loyalty that people feel when they know or are familiar with a character or a world. But most important to me is because it's art. Okay, now listen, it's commercial art, but commercial arts like television and comic books have a great way of touching you, of reaching out to you, of making you feel stuff, right? So games should be able to do that too, and certainly character development and storytelling should be part of that. It changes people, it touches people, but we suck at it. We are famous for sucking at it because it always feels like it's stuck on with a staple gun. I keep justifying this because it's a young art. It is an art that's still figuring this stuff out, so give it time. And actually, the way I often talk about this I borrow from a guy named Heinrich Wölfflin. Heinrich Wölfflin was an art historian who's famous for talking about classical art and how during the classical era and the Renaissance, right, all these artists refigured out how to draw the human form. It's called the Age of Humanism. So they went back to the Greeks and the Romans, and they got out of that medieval goop, and they started getting the real proportions right. And this is the famous Michelangelo's David. It's gorgeous, it's great, but really it's in a box. It's what he called the Renaissance window, because you can only really look at this from one angle. You start to look at it from the side, it's not that interesting. Let me cover him up. So what he famously does is he compares this to another David from Bernini 100 years later, which is a Baroque sculpture, which is gorgeous from every angle. Bernini just kills it. It's amazing that he could do this with stone because David just reaches out and he comes into your space. So the analogy I use with video games is that typically what we keep seeing and have kept seeing is characters in a window, characters in a box. And what we want to see is characters that combine themselves into play, that break out of that window, that break out of that box, that aren't just stapled in, but feel meaningfully integrated into play. That's kind of where real value would be, right? But we keep seeing characters in a box. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk a little bit about what's been going on right under our nose in the last 5 or 6 years, where characters are starting to break out of the box and what we can do about it. So here we go. I'm going to take us back to 2007. 2007, I gave a talk at Casual Connect about what's the best practices for doing characters in games. I have a little bit of that in here I'm going to refer to. But that same year, at the same time, amazing things happened in gameplay, in gaming, especially in core gaming. I think it was a watershed year because these 4 games all came out in 2007. Mass Effect, BioShock, Portal, and Uncharted all came out. They've all been sequelized since, some of them twice, and they did amazing things with storytelling and character development in the world of core games, and they paved the way for other core games that have done a breathtaking work with story and character. And these games are not free to play. They are super expensive, actually, and they represent incredible investments in character development and storytelling. They do so much right. If you go back to that talk I gave at the same time that these were coming out, they hit it all. There's all of these games have a rich story world with rules, characters with rich backstory and complexity, with weaknesses and vices. The people who did these games did a ton of sample dialogue before they hit the game. And they allow for not just inner conflict, but most of these games use an ensemble cast to create conflict between characters. The characters use visual distinction. They don't just look like every other character that you see in video games. At least then they didn't. And then they do a lot to actually put the player and the controlling of the character, and the control of that character into the player's hands, so that as you play through, you figure out more and more about the character. They have rich storytelling using the audio and the voiceover. They take the fourth wall very seriously. There's very rare where the game talks directly at you and breaks the fourth wall. And these games also, when they tell their stories, they start fairly deep, allowing the player to close the gap between what has been told and what they think is going to be told. So again, these games, not free to play, really broke a lot of new ground, and right at the same time that I was asked to give that talk. At the same time, in Casual, we actually had seen a maturation, right? So just a little art history here. If you looked at 2001 or 2002, this is what a character looked like in a Casual game. Over the years, right, we saw worms, we saw fish, we saw people who ran diners, we started to see bakers and hair salonists, and pretty soon in 2006 we saw the Mystery Case File series, and then suddenly detectives and all kinds of mystery games. But by 2009 or 7 to 9, really, you couldn't approach the casual market really seriously without thinking, well, what's my story and character going to be? Those games just assumed you would have one. But they were more or less, and these games were also not free to play. This evokes the try before you buy model, right? This is the download, play for an hour, and then your DRM tells you got to pay. At the same time that there was this maturation, though, there was a major shift under the feet of people like me working in the field. And if you were into story and into character and wanted to do more with it, you were a little bit out of luck because you were about to argue with someone called a product manager who was going to tell you that you were going to have to move to social games and mobile games, and that, by the way, in social games anyway, there were no characters. There were no story. You didn't need them, and it was basically a character-free zone. This is 2009-ish. This is what social games looked like just 2009, so 3 or 4 years ago. Right? These were the state-of-the-art games. And of course, you could argue and you can argue, but really what you need to do is wait, because by 2011, social games also were filled with characters, and they were kind of echoing the downloadable space, and they were free to play. And maybe more so even than the games we saw in Casual, the characters were really felt like window dressing. Yes, they offered a charming narrative context, but they felt stapled on to the game, and they felt like they weren't using a lot of those devices that we were seeing in the core games, which is to say, you didn't get a sense that there was a rich backstory, that there was a lot of inner conflict with this character. There was rarely any use of voiceover, and the fourth wall was broken all the time. In fact, here it is being broken in all 4 of these games that I'm showing you here. So again, getting the characters out of the box and into the player's space was something that was tough to do. At the same time, the mobile market actually was doing, I think, more interesting things with this. In the early mobile games, we saw games like Angry Birds and Plants vs. Zombies with really charming characters that were actually integrated into the gameplay. But remember, these games were not free to play when they first came out, which begs the question, is there something about free-to-play games that makes it harder? Because what happened pretty quickly on is that people began to realize that in mobile, top-grossing games were actually the free games. And so we saw a migration of game makers and game publishers to the free-to-play model in mobile as well. Now, many games in mobile, and certainly most of the top-grossing ones, are free-to-play, and they're struggling with the same challenges of how to integrate a character that we've seen before. All right, so here's what I want to do. I want to talk a little bit about the ways free-to-play games make money, and a little bit of the way free-to-play games integrate characters, and then try to figure out ways to crisscross and experiment with where this might go. So some of the ways, and we'll talk about these in the future slides, that we see easy puzzle games, which monetize through energy typically. We see hard puzzle games like Candy Crush that monetize with power-ups and extra turns. We see a lot of RTS-like simulation games where multiple currencies and resources and timed re-engagement to accelerate show up. We see battle games with cards, and then we're even now seeing games that I still call free-to-play. They're edge case, where you can play the first episode for free, games like Telltale's The Walking Dead, or a bunch of the games you see that are coming out from Big Fish that are kind of adventure games. And then we're also seeing a bunch of trends in how characters are integrated into those. So we're seeing the window dressing that I talked about already, but we're also seeing characters as progress markers. I want to talk about that for a minute. We're seeing characters as cards in free-to-play games. We're seeing increasingly characters we know come into free-to-play games, and then also characters in episodic delivery. So let's talk about these 5 ways they make money and these 5 ways they integrate characters, and then let's try to see if we can mix and match them a little bit. So I'm not going to spend too much time on this. We talked about the window dressing already. This offers a charming, evocative narrative context to the play experience, but it doesn't do a whole lot to integrate the character into the play. 2, characters as progress markers. So I was all set to kind of rip Candy Crush apart for their characters, and then I sort of started looking more closely, and it occurred to me that I think they're actually brilliant. So here's what I was thinking about. You see how these little dragon I've got here, I'm like a 32, and I got a little dragon here. If you scroll around the map, and you've probably all done this, you see these like holes that are sort of begging to have pegs put in them, aren't they, right? And it turns out the pegs you're getting are these little stickery characters. I don't know, the dragon from Lemonade Lake, and the little robot lady whose name I don't know, even though I looked it up on the Candy Crush wiki and I couldn't find it. And it occurred to me that in this game, what they're doing is they're using characters as collectible markers of progress. And in order to do that, you have to think pretty hard about what's going to work with your character. Because for a character to feel collectible and to fill that visual barometer of progress with a peg that goes into a hole, it has to, and people make fun of me for using this word, but it has to feel fetishistic. It has to, I don't mean that in like the kinky way. I mean that in like the way that it feels like it has value inside it. If you look at these characters, like check it out, they're like these like paper dolls. I had these when I was a kid. These little brass things with the joints, and they flop you around. But they're not like on flimsy paper. Like she's on a stick, and she feels kind of tactile and dimensional, and you just kind of want to hold her in your hand. And when I think back about that same little talk that I tried to summarize in one slide, like I said, give it visual distinction, make it unique. And I gave this whole rant about how if you had Cookie Monster, you didn't need Muffin Monster. Like, go back to these characters. They're pretty unusual. Like, they're weird. And I think that if you're going to hit a visual barometer of progress and make something collectible, you got to, I'm giving that away. You have to think a lot about that. Anyone know their names? Now I gave it away because I showed it. But did anyone know their names before you saw this slide? Okay, they're Tiffy and Mr. Toffee, which I didn't know, and I'm not sure is anywhere in the game. But there's clearly some thought that's gone on to that. Okay, so now I have to pause for a minute and talk about this free-to-play RTS simulation-like game that we're seeing so many of. These games typically monetize with multiple currencies, multiple resources. There's typically a decorative space, you might call it a base camp, a town, a city, a dollhouse, with buildings in it that store your resources, that can be upgraded, that might be delayed, where you can pay to accelerate them, right? There's a tremendous amount of authentic opportunities here to convert a free player to a paying customer. So they're very popular and they're successful. We see them a lot. They're different. Some have PvP, some have accelerating upgrades, some have characters with quests, but we need to just sort of put this on the table because I'm going to talk about this in the context of a bunch of the other patterns I'm seeing. So I wanted to sort of get this out there. Okay, and by the way, these guys, we see games where they use characters as window dressing. We're seeing increasingly characters we know, the Smurfs, the Simpsons, the Hobbit.
And we're seeing even characters as cards, we'll talk about in a minute, and I think in Dragon Veil they're even used as progress meters to some extent. And they all tend to have a kind of decorative, up on the right here, this picture, these sort of maps of cities, of towns that you're building. Okay, so let's talk about those games and then the other methodologies that we're seeing that I've identified, which is characters as cards and or characters we know, and then characters in episodic delivery. So characters as cards. We're seeing a lot of games where you basically have a collectible card game with neat pictures of cards. Cards are characters. The characters have powers. You want to unlock more cards. You want to level them up. You want to forge or combine them or do fusion for them so you can win more battles, get more cards. Our own company has this one, Blood Realms. Really well known one that's doing super well is Rage of Bahamut, which is sort of similar, and frankly, in my old digs over at Disney, there was a fabulous game that basically does this as well. This is Avengers Alliance, done by the brilliant folks up in Seattle at Playdom, and these guys basically took a collectible card game at using the Avengers characters to put a battle game in the middle, add story context. Yeah, it's sort of window dressing, but they did something really interesting, which is they took a lot of what they knew about or were informed by with RTS games, and they brought in the concept of multiple currencies and resources to allow you to complete quests and upgrade your characters and upgrade your cards and do better in battle, and they even added a sort of a base camp-like area where you can unlock things and improve things. And so what's interesting about this, and we'll talk about this at the end, is the way it takes sort of standard ideas in battle games and card games and integrates other mechanics from the other world of free-to-play aspects. So it pushes it forward. But because I know less about the other game that's like this, I'll brilliantly talk about that, which is DC's card battle game Injustice Among Us. What's fascinating about this game is that there's two versions of it. You can play it on your iOS for free, and I have, and it's fun, and it's a battle game, and it encourages you to buy more cards to level up and to be able to unlock more cards and do better in your battle, but it has almost no story in it. So if you don't already know who Cyborg is and what his powers are, or his backstory is, or who Catwoman is and why you should care, you're a little lost. But it's free to play and it's fun, and it makes, I'm sure, a good amount of money. I'd love to know how much, by encouraging you to collect and upgrade more cards. I was stupid enough to buy both the free-to-play one, and then I bought the PS3 one, and I played that a bunch. And that one is really fun, a battle game with better graphics, as you might expect on the PlayStation. But what it really has, it's so different, because you can buy in-app purchases on this game too to fancy up your cards, basically. But it's tons of story. And it's a lot more story. It's like badass story, an alternate universe where Luthor blows up Metropolis and Superman goes all badass on him because Lois Lane dies, and you get the characters, you get their backstory. So there you have it. Free to play, almost no story. Not free to play, tons of story. Sort of maybe sadly the summary of where we're at. Characters as cards, I think, was being used quite a bit in other games. I would argue that Clash of Clans and Puzzles and Dragons and even Plants vs. Zombies Adventures kind of uses techniques from characters as cards to keep people in and hook people through in their games. We're seeing not just superhero games, but more games come in with characters that are licensed that we know. The Simpsons Tapped Out is a brilliant example of using not just characters to collect, but also characters in quest. You probably can't read these because they're too small, but here, I'm going to do a quest for Ned Flanders to do emergency Bible studies, and Apu needs to go home and feed the octuplets. If you know The Simpsons, most of us do, the way that they use characters to sort of immerse you in a humorous, narrative-driven experience and get you feeling connected. And the premise, by the way, is some nuclear accident, Homer blows up Springfield, and you've got to rebuild it. So you're building your base camp is Springfield. This is pretty fun. It's pretty tight. If you're working on these kind of games and you're interested in integrating characters, this is a pretty good example of it. Of course, they had the wonderful advantage of getting to work with the characters from The Simpsons to begin with, who are rich characters with all kinds of backstory and humor built into them. Okay, last one, characters in episodic segments. I played a lot of this game to kind of see how far I could get. I got really far for free, and then it kind of buzzed out on me. Then it said, you go, I need more than 1 minute. It's a rich story. It's a puzzle game. It's a lot like Dream Chronicles, a game that I published and played first. It has a deep story, a lot of characters. But probably the mama of them all, the one that knocked me out, is a game called The Walking Dead, which you might argue isn't free to play, but certainly the first episode is free to play, and it sort of tells you right up front, hey, if you like this, there's going to be 4 more episodes to get the whole story, and then it sends you in. And what they do here is they do a brilliant thing with a license. I call it the Commandi effect. Commandi was a comic book that Jack Kirby did when he moved to DC Comics comics from Marvel in the 70s. And he did it right at the time when Planet of the Apes was super popular. He basically asked the question, okay, the apes are in New York, what's in the rest of the country? And we're going to send this kid Commandi out to this post-apocalyptic world. The Walking Dead game does sort of the same thing in that it doesn't tell me about Rick Grimes and all the famous characters from the TV show and the comic. Instead, it invents a new character and says, what's going on in the rest of the country? And this character is introduced to us instantly with inner conflict. He's in a cop car being brought to jail because he's just been convicted of killing his wife, who he found in bed with another man. If there's ever a character ready for redemption, it's this guy. And he gets an opportunity for redemption. He meets a 9-year-old girl who's separated from her parents in this terrifying world, and he wants to protect her. This game does such a brilliant job of all of the things that you would you want a game to do in terms of storytelling. The characters are complex. There's tons of backstory. The dialogue is really well done. They know their characters well. They use audio brilliantly. There's tons of inner conflict that's established for the character, but then they use ensemble really well to create external conflict as well, so you're pretty hooked in. Now, you might say, Kenny, that's not free to play, but it is. The first one is. And I think, to end this talk on sort of like getting people inspired, I think the coolest things we're seeing are where people experiment or cross over between methodologies for monetizing free-to-play games and methodologies for integrating characters into games. So I'll leave with asking you some questions. Can these RTS-like games learn from episodic games at least about some of the character development tricks they're doing? Can we get better characters in those games? What can episodic games learn from the RTS card battle games about monetization? For example, what if you had resources and currencies and got them to work in a free-to-play adventure game? What if you had to pay resources to go back and change the decisions you made? This would be especially impactful, I think, if people are watching you in a social context. How might a free-to-play city builder game benefit, of course, from the rich character development that we see in games or world-class voiceover that we're seeing in The Walking Dead? Again, I think the games that combine, games like Avengers, that combine these things, or again, this is neat. This is the end of The Walking Dead. You get this kind of scene that sort of tells you how did your decisions compare to others. And I didn't like one of my decisions. I went back and replayed to change one of my decisions, but it occurs to me that if I had to grind for some in-game currency to go back, or if I had to, or pay, or if it was free to keep going, or free to go back, but only if I could pay that in-game currency, there's not enough experimentation around this that I think could work to create actually more richer characters in the free-to-play games and more free-to-play payment mechanics in the story games. So my last sort of call to action here is to try experimenting, combining, and pushing, because that's the way we'll get this guy to break out of his window and into our player space and push the whole thing forward a little bit. All right, thank you.
Questions for Kenny? There's got to be some questions. Come on.
Please raise your hand and I'll bring the mic to you.
I was wondering how you would approach creating a character that has all the depth that you're looking for, but you still have to basically do what you might do on Gardens of Time, where all you see is their flat picture. I'm working with one developer who said that they want to be able to see immediately everything that character is about, and it has to be conveyed visually. And my concern is that subtext will be lost. For example, if you want a really nice person who dresses like a villain, maybe you can't do that if you have this sort of flat, free-to-play model.
I mean, I think the answer to that is just try it. Like, take the time to write the backstory. Take the time to do the work, and then see how much more. First of all, I argue that if you do that, the work will go faster. Like, I mean, how many times have you struggled writing some dumb dialogue box with a character in it for a character you don't know, and because you don't know who the character is or what their story is, you bang your head against the wall going, I don't know what to write here, I don't know what to say, I don't know how they would say it, because I don't actually know the character. I use this thing with my teams called the Anvil Test, which is, okay, you got a character, and they're walking down the street, and an anvil falls out of the sky, boom, in front of them. What do they say? And if you can't answer that question, then don't write for that character, because you don't actually know the character well enough. So at least get to the point where you can pass the Anvil test, and then jump in and see what it does. I mean, it may help you both with writing faster, and it may also help you with design, working with the artist to get the character's look down, because now you have a better sense of would they wear a hat, would they have a backpack, would their hair be in their eyes, would they stand up straight, would they be handsome, would they be heavy. Those things can get answered by doing the work. So write the backstory, write the history, write their flaws, write it down, and see where it takes you. And then, see, I'm not sure that answers your question, but okay.
Hey, Kenny. Great talk. Kind of a personal question, since I know your love of comic books. In Injustice on the iPad and iOS, did the fact that all of the characters play exactly the same, regardless of who they are, ruin the illusion for you as someone who knew the characters and their backstories?
On the iOS, the whole thing was, it just felt so random to me. It was fun, it was cool characters that I knew, that had no narrative context, really. It was a battle game, and it felt like I was flipping cards with a friend at the playground, so it was like taking the license and applying it to, a card game. Whereas, yeah, the PS3 one has so much more character depth and so much more narrative context that you kind of feel like, ooh, I really want to get to that next chapter and unlock it. I would love to see more overlap there, right? Because I think there's so much promise in the free-to-play games, frankly, making more money if they get it right, not just being funner. So, if they can make more money, why can't they have more story, I guess, is the question. And, I'm looking for hints of ways to do that. And I think, the Walking Dead game's a really interesting one. But of course, it stops being free pretty soon. Injustice Among Us, at least hats off, they tried 2 versions. They tried to give us a free-to-play version.
Anything else? A quick one. I understand the point that you're making with the 2 versions of the David, but have you been to Florence? Have you seen David?
Sure.
I mean, I was just there, and I was dumbstruck in front of that David. Now, I've never seen the Bernini live, so I can't draw the inference, but man, that sometimes a static character is also staggering. Just a comment.
Oh, for sure. And, every time I get storyboards from Michelangelo, I'm blown away. But we don't have a lot of storyboard artists in our industry who are Michelangelo. So A, go see the Bernini statue because it'll kill you. And B, sure, there's lots of great games now that use character in that stagnant way. I mean, Candy Crush doesn't do much more. I mean, progress markers. And I think it's a brilliant execution and a brilliant game. But yeah, there's more to go. And Baroque art in general, I think, just blows away classical art. It's just classical art's more famous. But I mean, if you dig deep, think about it, Rembrandt, Caravaggio, Bernini, I'm losing Rubens, all the Baroque masters really are completely insanely great. And they took classical art and really did take it to a much more insanely cool level. So it's really, if you get deep into that stuff, it's a place to kind of explore and go.
I feel you. I feel you.
Classical masters are great. Anything else? Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Kenny. Thank you. Great presentation.